everyone. Listeners, welcome back to Lights, Camera, Accolade, the podcast where we watch the Academy Award winners for Best Picture chronologically and try our best to put them into context despite none of us being experts in any related fields. But hopefully we can make both history and movies more interesting for everyone, and you can stick with us as we go through this process. And if you didn't listen to our intro episode, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Jake.
I'm Chrysantha.
And before we get into the nominees this year, I wanted to talk a little bit about the formation of the Oscars. Not to really go in depth at all, but just to give people an idea, because this was the first year, obviously, that the Oscars started, hence why we're starting here instead of earlier in film. And the idea for the Oscars, something that I learned while researching, this was a time in Hollywood where you had almost more like unionization efforts ultimately between Hollywood's construction workers and the actors and the writers and the directors. Everyone involved in filmmaking was realizing as these productions got larger and larger and was really becoming a vehicle that was not just like, ooh, fun pastime for everyone. This was like, no, this is a major form of production it's already bringing in money and talent and people. So obviously workers were wanting to have more of a cut, more agency in all of that and helping develop what it is. So Louis B. Mayer, one of the largest producers at the time, in part of an effort to squash that in ways, came up with the idea of the Oscars, of creating this sort of award ceremony, which in his own words was to control people in giving them a shared goal that was not about affecting the production of movies, but instead about creating movies that would benefit studios, right? Making the best movies possible. And I do want to just quote him in how he described his intentions with the Oscars, because again, I found it almost villainous. So he said, "I found that the best way to handle movie makers was to hang medals all over them. If I got them cups and awards, they'd kill themselves to produce what I wanted. That's why the Academy Award was created." And it worked. You know, he was absolutely correct that it would turn attention away from kind of bettering the working conditions and bettering the job opportunities for people who are trying to break into the industry, and instead really just focus in on let's make audiences happy. Let's make a movie where the Academy can essentially proclaim this as the best movie made this year. And in a way, we're kind of falling into that trap still today. You know, we are like, out of all of the movies made in all of this time in history, we are choosing to look at Best Picture as the barometer of what was the best at the time. And so kind of oops, but also just shows you the power of that identification of what really will motivate people and stand the test of time. And so,
you know, Sarah, the more you tell me about this Louis B. Mayer guy, the more I am just like creeped out. He really does sound like a proto Harvey Weinstein, and he's similar to him in more ways than one. And I think we'll have occasion to maybe revisit that in the future.
Definitely.
But I can tell you he's right in one respect. As the former actor amongst our trio here, I can tell you that if you want to get to a performer's heart, or you want to get them under your thumb, like it seemed like he wanted to, all they want is approval. All they want is they're desperate for approval. There's something missing in our brains. It doesn't make us bad people necessarily, but goddamn, when we get that feeling of a crowd with applause is like no other, and it's a high that you've been looking for. So he cracked that code.
Jake, unapologetically and wholeheartedly speaking for all actors.
Of course. Yes. I've been deputized. I haven't performed in like 15 years, but I can tell you he was right about us.
Yeah.
Damn, that's what corporate America wanted, but failed.
Yeah.
Because then we realized pizza parties and employee of the month is
the same thing. Well, we, like you just said, we just started this podcast, so we're playing into it. We're talking about the biggest pizza party
Yeah.
winners in movie history.
Exactly. What if only one company got a pizza party every year? Then the employees would care about it.
He's right, though. I mean, it's an ebb and flow, I think, in Hollywood, and we'll see that in the decades to come, with studio
Right.
control and that more egalitarian bend, and in particular the activism around the post-war period, etc. I mean, the Red Scare was, in Hollywood, even stronger than it was in many other aspects of American life in the early 50s with McCarthyism and everything, the blacklist, etc. But it'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds. But what a genius, an ingenious and nefarious strategy. One that still defines, I think, the way we view the industry today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, Jake, I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about like the actual history of the time so we can contextualize what life was like outside of Hollywood, right? Outside of just the movies to understand a little bit about what was going on with everyday life.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a good opportunity to do that, considering how early we are in our story here. But just a little preface for everyone: do not worry if this starts to sound like a history lesson. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. But like Sarah said, I think it's useful for us to think about the wider context here.
The first movie we're going to be viewing is called Wings, and it won Best Picture at the Oscars, the very first Oscars, as you guys will know by now, in the year 1927. So I think it might be useful to kind of lay out where that falls, in the wider context here, and to get ourselves really ready for talking about this movie in that context and kind of relating it to, where we were as a country, where were as a world, and how that's going to shake out for future episodes. But in any case, we're talking about, just to start off here, we're talking about a time period that's very transitional, not just for America, but for the wider world writ large. We're coming on the heels of the Second Industrial Revolution, towards the end of the Gilded Age. If you're watching HBO's new show, then that was towards the end of that period. You're seeing the advent of mass production growing exponentially. So as a result of that, you're seeing mass movements of people to industrial areas. You're seeing, more concerningly, and as we'll touch on in relation to many of these films, you're seeing the industrialization of warfare, which leads to some really catastrophic and, I think, earth shattering realizations on the part of people up and down the social ladder about the new implications of many of these changes. And most importantly, from my perspective, you're starting to see a renegotiation of the social contract. And by that, I mean, when you look back at they call it the long 19th century, it's often viewed as a very stable time period, although there was unrest. But in general, certainly in comparison to the time period we're going to start talking about, it was a long kind of lull in the historical context. But with these massive dislocations brought about by all this rapid technological change, these movements of people, the changing nature of warfare, it leads to kind of pragmatically adaptations on the part of the managers of society. We're talking about the upper crux, the owners of businesses, the industrialists, the J.P. Morgans, the Henry Fords. They're starting to realize that in order for them to maintain society and their viewing of what that should look like and that social hierarchy, they're needing to make concessions at certain points, and most importantly, to maintain profits in this growing and adapting economic system, which is becoming more global, more industrial. So, a quote that I really love about this time period, that is kind of a bastardized quote. It's not exactly what the gentleman said, but it's like a rough interpretation. But Antonio Gramsci, the Italian philosopher, referred to this period with the following statement: "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And I think we're going to see that reflected in not only different events, but particular figures, and specifically when we get to, the 1930s. It's a fearful time because of many of those changes. It's also a very exciting time because, as I said, concessions are being made. People are formulating society in different ways. More benignly, with the enfranchisement of women in the United States at the dawn of the 1920s, you see very quickly a move towards prohibition for a period of time, which I think was unexpected in a lot of ways, manifestation, which is controversial to this day and was ultimately undone. So we're going to see different examples of how that unfolds, but this is going to be a really interesting time. And the cool thing about the 1920s is it's kind of a lull in a lot of this period of flux, in that we had this explosion of World War One. Society kind of had that hangover immediately after that of, holy shit, what did we just unleash? We had no idea this is what the face of warfare was going to look like when we marched off to this battle. And so I think in the 20s, people are starting to, ease back into comfort and kind of have a little fun again. Where this is the era of the flappers, this is the era of jazz music, Art Deco style transitioning into modernism. And it's a really interesting time period because it's still, while there were some reforms in the direction of kind of tampering down control over this economic system in the earlier progressive era, presidents like Roosevelt, even Taft and Wilson, introducing the Federal Reserve and trying to get control over these cyclical banking crises. Um, Still, we're in that laissez-faire mentality of the 19th century, broadly speaking, and we are about to see that blow up in a couple of years here. So this is a great time to start because 1927, in a way, is the end of an era. It's the end of that, I think, myth that everyone was telling themselves, okay, maybe World War One was just an aberration here, and we can get back to the way things were. But very quickly, we're going to find out with the advent of these different cultural and structural changes that's just impossible, and we're going to have to deal with the implications of that. And for our purposes, we're going to see how that translates into the film and the cultural products of the era.
Obviously, the 20s, as you said, is known for the flappers and kind of being the roaring 20s. But I think that comes from feeling like the worst was over, right? And we, looking back, know that that's not the case at all, that actually much more horrific things are on the horizon for people alive at this time. And putting yourself in the mindset, though, where World War I was truly the worst thing that the world had ever seen on a large scale. And as a result of that, the development of the League of Nations, where it's like, okay, we're going to maintain world peace from now on because we saw how terrible it is when we don't do that. Now we're good. We solved it. We solved war, you guys. We just needed the Great War, and nothing will ever be that bad again. So I could fully understand what it was maybe like to be an optimist or an idealist at that time period, where you couldn't fathom that after something so horrific, we would ever double down and return to that. So you kind of had two distinct mentalities and mindset at the time. You mentioned modernism and that movement because you had people coming back from actually seeing the horrors of war, feeling like life at that point, returning to normalcy, was absurd, right?
Yeah.
That the rules didn't matter. Life was not what it was promised to be. And the war was always controversial, especially in America,
Right.
which was so far away, from where all of these kind of events were happening. I know Woodrow Wilson kept America out of the war during his first term, and that was one of the things that he ran on, was like, oh, vote for Woodrow, he kept us out of the war. And then a month after his second term, he's like, hey guys, we're going. So you had a lot of pro-war heroic soldier sentiment, but you also had a lot of anti-war sentiment. And I think that was also true afterwards. But afterwards, you have the viewpoint of the realities of the horror of what war has become. It always was, but now with increase in weaponry, it really dehumanizes the individual. So you had that horror, but you also had the thought of like, it's behind us. So
Right.
you had some movies, and I don't know which way Wings goes ultimately, that still looks back and kind of glorifies the heroes, right? Like it was worth it. War can still be heroic. You can still make a difference, sort of thing. And then you'll have things like we keep mentioning All Quiet on the Western Front, but that is something that is like, no, it's ugly and it just destroys lives for what? For nothing. And it's again, it's just interesting contextually to see what war movies are at this time period in terms of what the intent was for people looking back at something that was very recent in their collective memory. So
there was a really big adoption, culturally and societally here in America for people that, I think everyone just wanted to kind of have more of a blissful time, I guess. They wanted to escape. They wanted to enjoy life again. I mean, who can blame them after everything, after all those years and stuff? And so cinema was greatly affected by with that same mentality of an escapist. Filmmakers wanted to focus more on providing that through movies and allowing the audience to kind of become entrenched in those films. So there was a really big focus on making movies that had themes of like romance, adventure, historical epics. Obviously, we'll see that this year with Wings. And then with the two nominees that we watched as well, there's really big themes of romance, especially with Seventh Heaven. It's interesting just to see, I guess as a society, we can adopt something together and then have those, have those ideas be represented within, I guess, production. It's interesting to see that shift just with people adopting that more. Let's move away from something that's sad and morose, and let's escape into something better. And
yeah, I feel like that's super just interesting conceptually, because I feel like people across time have always looked to creative outlets to escape things. And so this time, like you're saying, post World War I, in this just this period of flux, this period of change, there's that desire to kind of get into a happier, healthier headspace and get to enjoy what these new technologies are able to provide.
It has a nullifying effect to some of the horrors that we're going to see, but some of the truly groundbreaking films, I think, are going to reflect some of that pain in a real way. And it'll be interesting to see as we come up on the era when censorship plays a better part in what movies get produced, what gets publicized, what gets awarded, what gets the accolades, what's going to be the intentionality there.
It's easy to forget, I feel like, as a modern viewer, and we'll probably get into this a little bit when we talk about the nominees, but it's easy to forget some of those pieces during that time, especially when movies will have drinking or whatever. But in this case, one of the movies dealt with the illegality of prohibition, the crime that kind of caused as well. So it's just interesting to be like, oh, this was very relevant at this time. This was actually happening. So
maybe that's a good segue to start to talk a little bit about the nominees this year. Not to say the picture that won, which we're about to watch, but the two runners up, because in this year there were actually only 3 pictures up for Best Picture in the first year of the Oscars. So aside from Wings, which we're about to watch, we also, leading up to this discussion, watched the 2 nominees. The first one being The Racket, which is kind of an interesting movie about a rivalry between a mobster played by an actor with some very distinctive facial features, which we all commented on in watching it. He had kind of a scrunched in nose that made for a very dramatic presence. But the movie centers on his conflict during the height of this prohibition era that Sarah referenced with an incorruptible police officer. And it really boils down to what ultimately was a violent confrontation between them. It deals with, issues of corruption, police corruption, city corruption, corruption of the legal system, that I imagine was very timely for that time period. But it was a silent film, as all the films this year were. So it was very interesting sort of introduction for us, I would say, into that genre. But some of the things that stood out to me about that movie, really strong and interesting female character who sort
Hmm.
of acted as the voice of reason between that mobster character and that police officer, and some really impressive camera work as well. This was something I noticed with all the silent movies was, when you take out that element of dialogue, it really, I think, kind of forces the filmmakers to focus a bit more on the visuals. And so in this movie in particular, I felt there was some very kind of interesting and almost like avant-garde filming techniques in that way. But that was one of the films, The Racket. And we also watched a film called Seventh Heaven, which was sort of a tragic, but ultimately, not to be too spoilery about it, but ultimately feel good movie about two up and coming young people who are members of the city of Paris's underclass at the start of the 20th century, at the start of this time period we're dealing with. One was a young girl who lived in a very abusive family situation. She escapes that early in the film, and she ends up sort of being saved or connecting with this young and ambitious street peddler whose big dream at first in the movies to become like an official street sweep, and so he takes her in. They, over the course of movie, develop a really strong bond that ultimately blossoms into love. And then, of course, because of the time period we're dealing with, that's sort of interrupted by the tragic circumstances of that time, and in particular World War I. And so their burgeoning love comes up against the reality of the hardship of that time, and ultimately is tested in what I felt was a really powerful way. So that was another silent movie that we watched, and two kind of very different genres, but ultimately
Yeah, very.
interesting in my opinion.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the mobster in The Racket, Louis Wilhelm. When I was researching a little bit, I found out he had had his nose broken in like a football game, and then later that same day got into a fist fight with someone, which further damaged his nose. But the thing that kind of like is a little bit heart wrenching is he actually always wanted to play more of the like romantic lead
Ooh.
type of person, but because of kind of the his broken nose and everything, he was always cast as like the big mobster spooky guy, or at least like a rough around the edges sort of thing. So I just thought that was really sad. And he and this may be just like too much trivia, but he tried to get a nose job to be able to start getting some of those roles, but the United Artists Association, which was Charlie Chaplin's organization, actually stopped him from doing that because they were like, please don't ruin
Wow.
such an iconic face.
I
So,
mean, in a
yeah.
sense, they were right, but that's kind of
Yeah, yeah.
messed up
Yeah, it's
that
sad
they're,
for
yeah.
him, but I'm glad that we get to see, because it is just nice to see distinct or interesting actors and actresses at the time. So,
If you look up the concept of a heavy in casting in this period and early film in general, that is to say, actors that became essentially typecast as villains or at least tough guys. This guy, it should be his face in the dictionary.
yeah, no, that's literally okay. So in the article, it said that he was typecast as heavies, and I was like, I don't even know what that means. So I'm glad that you have that little bit of like acting knowledge.
Honestly, kind of a cool position to be in career wise, because you can kind of just get into that niche and ride it professionally. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it seems cool, but he obviously
yeah,
wanted
that's
more.
sad for him.
But I really liked the
Yeah.
Racket. I enjoyed Seventh Heaven. I know you really like that, so I'm sure you'll get to talk a bit more about that. But to me, I was just surprised that the Racket was dealing with those themes of like police corruption. So that, and obviously, as you mentioned, the main female character, she was one of my favorites. I mean, it's a small sample size, but just seeing how she was very like
Right.
self-assured, as you said, kind of the voice of reason. It was just a breath of fresh air from, I guess, what I was expecting, even of like a damsel in distress type of person.
Right.
And And yeah, as for cinematography, like you're saying, there were just like interesting things that I was surprised by. There was that shot where they have their guns under the table sort of thing. So it's like a standoff that no one else can really see. But the way that the
cool.
camera frames it is like, it's very reminiscent of like a Han Solo Greedo type shot, which I thought was cool because this is, 50 years before.
Careful, our fan base might be, riled up by that question of who shot first. We don't know if we have any Star Wars fans here, so.
Yeah, very true. So I really liked The Racket. I enjoyed Seventh Heaven, but it felt a little long, honestly, for me.
I really enjoyed Seventh Heaven, and like I admitted in our intro episode, I'm a little bit of a sap when it comes to certain movies. And it was funny because the ending, as it transpired, I wasn't really expecting. I was kind of expecting them to go that full tragic route, just because there were like hints of that throughout the film.
I think I would have preferred that, but
right. Well, we
but
know
yeah.
if listeners don't know by now, Sarah has kind of a dark taste when it comes to storytelling, which is I think a good foil to my own kind of altar boy mentality. But in any case, no, I liked that movie. I thought it was really cute, and I thought I saw a lot of threads of later romantic movies and even rom-coms, you might say, like generations from now. I could see them even maybe drawing on lessons from this. I mean, it's pretty timeless theme. You can go back to Romeo and Juliet
Yeah.
and things. But in this case, there's a happier outcome. They both survive the war and end up together, but there's a great cost for one of the characters, certainly.
Right. I guess you saying even like threads of rom-com type stuff with Seventh Heaven. I didn't really think about it at the time, but them kind of being forced in the movie into a living situation where they're sharing close quarters. Like I feel like that gets used so much in rom-coms.
Right.
This the prototype is this where this sort
At
of
least
thing
in a
came
modern
from.
sense, I think. Yeah.
I really liked both of the movies. I think I liked The Racket a little bit more just because I have more of a proclivity to, I guess, more mobster kind of like crime movies.
Yeah.
I mean, not saying that Seventh Heaven wasn't good. I did enjoy it. I liked the lightheartedness of it, and it is kind of like the epitome of what like the escapism that Hollywood was trying to go for at the time. And so like even
That's a good
though
point.
even though it has such a really like a kind of like a heavy topic, the love interest gets sent away. She's kind of like, I don't know if he's going to return. But at the same time, the movie doesn't necessarily focus on that aspect. It's more of a focus on the romance between them and the love that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very sweet. And I think it's something that probably a lot of, the women or just in general, the audience could kind of relate to, is just kind of like, I don't know if they want to remember that time of the person that they love being sent away, but
For sure.
I think the fact that movie ended in a happy ending made them feel, probably good, kept their spirits light. And then with The Racket, and here's like kind of like a fun little tidbit, the director who made that movie was actually the same person who made All Quiet on the Western Front. And so I thought that was very interesting.
It's such a different movie also, like a war movie versus a mobster movie. So it kind of just shows how directors weren't hemmed into a certain genre, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting though. I was like, they're just so different. But yeah, like kind of relating more to technological advancements and the way the films were filmed or silent films, like a lot of it, yes, had to do with camera work because of the fact, like Jake said, there's no sound. So a lot of it was open to interpretation when you didn't have the little cue cards on screen. So the directors relied a lot on the setting the scene and then making sure, there was kind of like really in your face emotional kind of expressions for the audience to kind of pick up on, even when there's dialogue happening and there's no sound, you don't know what they're saying, but you can kind of pick up on the subtleties of what's going on, even though you don't have the the insight into what they're saying. And I actually found this pretty interesting because coming from, you know, obviously we're in 2024 and we're so used to having movies with sound, and then reverting back to movies without sound, it's almost like you have to work to understand the movie. And it's not like a bad thing. I actually kind of like that. It makes it a little bit more engaging and makes it a lot more fun. I also found myself looking at the screen a lot more, because sometimes when I watch movies during kind of like the scenes where it's like a lull or kind of like a dull scene, I'll pick up my phone, or kind of, you know, my mind wanders off.
You've just angered so many cinephiles with that statement.
I totally get it. Our attention spans have been obliterated these days. Like, I like that the Hulu account I use sometimes has commercials, because that's my phone time.
So Jake likes commercials as the one person who does.
Yeah, but like with silent films, I find you can't do that. If you spend too much time, you know, dissociating or looking at your phone, like you can miss a cue card. You can miss integral, I guess, acting that helps you glue together what is going on in the movie. So I just think that's pretty cool and very interesting. I guess I would consider myself, or ourselves, like time travelers, because we're in the future, or we're in the present, but we're going back in time to kind of experience what people back then experienced in, you know, the movie theaters when, you know, with silent films. And then I mean, this being the era of the last couple of silent films being created, and then, you know, from then on, it's going to be nothing but, you know, talkies. Yeah. So very, very cool.
Yep. I am, like, even having watched these, that does already kind of make me sad, because I guess I wasn't aware of, you know, how much of old Hollywood we were missing out on by starting with the Oscars, where it was like already right at that change, basically. So there is a part of me where I'm just like, dang, I kind of want to go back and watch some of the other silent epics that we might have missed out on, but we have so many movies to watch on our plate already that it'll probably be a while before I get to that. But
it'll be a sequel series,
silent podcast, but do cue cards instead.
It's just YouTube videos of black screens with text. No, I just wanted to take a moment to really reinforce what you said, Chrysantha and Sarah, about, you know, this being such a almost otherworldly medium. I mean, it really puts these silent films, really puts the visual in visual storytelling. It's really a distinct experience, all the more fun to watch with other people.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's jump into it then. The three of us are now going to watch 1927's Wings, a war movie, but maybe not quite one as hard-bitten as some of the ones we're used to in modern day. But we'll find out, and we'll let you know, and we'll be right back. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. If you are following along with us, you will have likely recently watched Wings, which the three of us just completed. And I gotta tell you, we've got strong opinions. Very positive, I think, so far as the tenor. But let me get into a little bit of an overview of the movie for our listeners who maybe didn't watch it or aren't following along in the same way. Wings takes place, and I think it was 1917. Is that right, guys?
Yeah.
And so we're in small town, rural America, and it starts with two young guys and two young women. And one young guy is kind of working class mechanic, really kind of like salt of the earth type boy. His name's Jack. And then we've got another guy named David Armstrong, who comes from the wealthiest family in the town. And so it's kind of an idyllic existence, it seems like, at first. And they're both kind of pining after the same girl in town named Sylvia. But Sylvia really likes David, the wealthier guy. And the other guy's kind of struggling to impress her and make an impression, while he is totally oblivious to this other female character, Mary, who's his neighbor and who he's been presumably like childhood friends with, and she's kind of trying to get his attention. He doesn't notice it. Anyway, that's setting the characters. But very quickly on, they get called off to war, World War I, as we know, and they both get drafted into the burgeoning Air Force, which at this time was really new in warfare. But the meat and potatoes of the movie is them in the European front engaging in these aerial battles, which I have to say, you guys, I was not expecting it to be as kind of visually engaging and intensive as it was for that time period. But in any case, hijinks ensue, so to speak. But no, they have several battles. They grow closer. They start out as sort of rivals because of their mutual love for Sylvia, but over the course of the war, become real brothers in arms and very close, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then towards the end, there's a misunderstanding rooted in their mutual affection for Sylvia, which causes a fight right before they're about to head off into their last battle. And in that battle, David, who made a I don't want to get into the details of it for people who haven't seen it, but he knowingly makes a personal sacrifice for his friend that upsets his friend Jack. And in the battle, David is defending Jack from other German fighters, and he is shot down in German territory and hit in the arm behind enemy lines. It looks like he's as good as dead. And as far as Jack knows, he is dead. And Jack goes on kind of a war path, unleashing a reign of terror on the Germans and shooting down anything he can find, while David is trying to sneak back to the American lines, bloodied but still alive, and somehow kind of taking a page out of the book of Top Gun Maverick or vice versa, he steals a German plane and starts flying back to the American side. But as the battle is winding down and Jack is also heading home, he sees this lone German plane, which unbeknownst to him has his friend David. So with him still in his bloodied rage of vengeance, shoots down David's plane, and David is hit, mortally wounded, and crashes. And of course, Jack lands down to find that he has inadvertently killed his best friend. But they have a moment, they connect, they express their affection for each other in what was a very intimate scene, surprising to me for the time. But ultimately, Jack is the one who returns back to America. It's his sort of version of events that's told, but I would say there's a resolution. But let's get into it. Let's get into kind of our feelings at this point and the impact we feel like this movie may have had or had on us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say that I personally was really surprised. Having watched the two other nominees, I thought I knew more or less what we were in for, which was like early film. You know, you get some characters that you resonate with a bit, but there's still a lot that feels like stage acting or caricatures. It feels very different than what we're used to in modern film in terms of immersion or character depth that we're able to see through the storytelling. But this from the get-go was very engaging. I think the director did a fantastic job in really using techniques even in the mundane parts, or especially in the mundane parts of the movie, that brought you in close to understand the personalities of these people, how youthful they were and full of hope, and how, you know, their friendship changed over the course of time, how the war changed them over time. And then, of course, the actual filming of like the dogfights, of the stunts, everything in the air was absolutely just blew me away. As Jake mentioned, kind of Top Gun Maverick, little bits of that where you have, you know, people, the cameras are actually in the planes with the actors.
Right.
You know, they have someone else piloting from behind them, but these people were actually in the air shooting these scenes. Maybe Chrysantha did a bit more research potentially about the stunts that were performed, not to put her on the spot or anything, but I was just so impressed at how they did this. And I'm not normally a fan of war movies, especially ones with like long action sequences. And this movie did have a little bit of that, But for
One
90%,
criticism, yeah, I would say is the
yeah,
one criticism it dragged a little bit with some of the war sequences. But
right.
if, like you said while we were watching it, if you put yourself in the position of someone in
Hmm.
1927, wow, what an exciting thing that must have been in the theater communally.
Exciting and horrifying,
Right,
right?
right.
Because seeing it on the big screen in that kind of like violent chaos, is just a very different experience. So I get it. And it all was very technically impressive as well as engaging throughout, I thought.
Hmm. Yeah, like I enjoyed it. I actually like war movies. I mean,
Mm,
not like I don't I guess support war or anything like that. I don't know. I do enjoy them. I do agree. Some of the sequences were long, like they kind of dragged out a bit, and that was one of the notes one of the notes I took note of when watching these, like the films, like not only this one, but also the other two nominees as well. It's just, I think it's just something that's common with silent films is that I noticed that some of the shots of the scenes in general were just pretty long compared
mhm.
to, I mean, present day film now, where they cut up the shots in different angles and stuff like that, just to, support the cinematography or whatever they're trying to get convey to the audience. But I did do like research and stuff, and like obviously everything is like real. It's like, I don't know, would that be considered like practical effects?
Yeah,
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 definitely.
yeah.
right?
And that
Okay.
was one thing that I felt made this so much on a certain level. I mean, obviously it's dated, but the impressiveness, the level of intensity that you feel in
Hmm.
knowing, you see little bodies flying, you're like, is that a stunt man or is that a dummy? And there's a lot of points where you just don't know, and that speaks to the lengths they were willing to go to
Right.
with this movie that you just don't see, starting really in the advent of computer generation, but
I
even
mean,
for that.
partially probably for safety,
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
and to the benefit of some
I'm
people.
not saying it was a good thing, but sorry,
Yeah.
Chrysantha, I think I cut you off.
Wait, and I do also have a question potentially. I don't know if you came across this while you were researching a bit about how some of those sequences were filmed, but I wrote down a note while we were watching that is how film bombs. Two
Yeah.
question marks. So, were they real bombs? Like how that was another thing that I was, I guess, curious about because some of the shots that they had, those aerial views of foot soldiers on the ground while explosions are going on around them, are people safe? Did that come up at all when you were looking it up?
I didn't read a lot of like or see anything about like the bombs.
Hmm.
It's also really hard because I was doing research while I was watching the movie.
Yeah,
You
fair.
have to look up every now and then to make sure you're reading and paying attention. Um, I know for the like at least the plane scenes and even the gunshots, like with the gunshots that they would use like smoke to that
Mm,
like imitate
Yeah.
like the gun had fired. And then with the planes, I came across an article that was specifically about like how they filmed those scenes not only in Wings but in other films that released in like the 20s and the 30s. And it seemed like after like World War II or World not War II but World War One, when it was over, there was a lot of people who were aviators at the time that ended up kind of jumping into the stunt man or kind of like
So veterans of the war
mm,
that would do
yeah,
that.
like kind of like what you see at air shows where they do
Yeah.
like those tricks in the skies and the airplanes.
yeah,
And so
yeah.
some of them ended up doing that as a career. And then, like with Hollywood and filmmakers seeing that, a lot of those veterans or stuntmen, even they didn't, some of them weren't even veterans, but the stuntmen were recruited by Hollywood directors saying, like, we want to do a movie in the sky. And so they would have these stunt people go and like do these stunts
Mm,
for them in the movie. So everything you see is real. So even like with the planes, and there's this particular dude, Dick Grace, and he was the specific one to coordinate a lot of the stunts in Wings. He was pretty well known in the stunt world as like just, being skillful. And when he saw that they were using the World War II, like the deteriorated World War One, I keep saying two, World War One planes, he actually hired like engineers, and he himself worked on not disassembling the planes, but making them a little bit weaker, so that way in the scenes when the planes crashed, you actually saw them come apart.
Mm.
And before they hit the ground, what they would do is they would have the stunt people parachute out, or sometimes even crawl out of the cockpit and get on the wings and jump off
That's
like
insane.
that. Yeah.
That's insane.
And so there were so
I will give you
many.
$10.
Definitely, this was before the labor movements of the 30s.
Yeah, it was
Say
crazy because
that.
there were so many people that did. They ended up dying like that or getting
Jeez.
severely hurt. Like even this guy, like Dick Grace, he ended up getting hurt in that scene with the big German ship, which is called a Fokker. It's Fokker. He was supposed to land in a body of water, but it ends up going wrong, and he ends up getting stuck in the plane because I think it flips, and he hurts his. He ends up breaking his neck, but like not death,
Right.
but
Oh my
he
God.
messes up some vertebrae in his neck because he hit the ground at 110 miles per hour, and
Jeez.
the impact caused the straps holding him to snap, and his head went into the instrument panel. And
Jesus.
when they pulled him from the wreckage, he seemed unhurt, but then later on collapsed. And then when they examined him, that's when they found out that he had a broken neck.
Oh man.
And he's got like paralysis on the side of his face, and the doctors tell him, like you gotta, cool it for stunts right now, but he didn't listen. And I mean, this is just kind of like going like a side
This is interesting.
but
Yeah.
he ends up not listening, and he sneaks out of the hospital where he's being kept because he wants to go see his girlfriend. And when the girlfriend sees how he looks and the side of his face is paralyzed, they don't specify if it was permanent or not, but at the time when she saw him, she left him.
Wow.
She at that point in time she decided to get engaged to another guy. And so when that happened to him, he went back and he was like, okay, I'm going to finish my recovery. And obviously, I mean, he went back and did stunts for Hollywood and stuff like that. But I read that and I was like, that's so
Sounds
sad.
like a supervillain
Yeah.
origin story to me, almost like
Yeah,
where
for
the
sure.
resentment comes in.
That did also remind me that the director of Wings, I believe William Wellman, he was a combat pilot during World War One. He was decorated in the French Air Force. So I think that's why we get such impressive dogfights and kind of insight into what it was like to be a combat pilot at that time, because he knew intimately what it was like when you were up there in the skies and kind of the dangers and anxieties that you would face. And I guess on that note as well, it is definitely a movie where you come out of it just impressed by the like bravery, right? The valor of these pilots and the soldiers in war, where again, we don't know that it's really capturing the horrors of war, but it's hard to say what audiences at the time, because perhaps those fighting sequences that were more violent, especially for the foot soldiers on the ground, maybe that was enough for some people to be like, wow, war is terrible. And we're just so desensitized because of the footage that we see constantly and the war movies that are a bit more gruesome, you know? So it's obviously honoring the soldiers, but what was it saying about the war overall? Maybe not really anti-war.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it was something that I wasn't sure how it was going to land going into this film. And I would say on the spectrum from All's Quiet on the Western Front being one of the more brutal portrayals of war to like Rambo on the other extreme, or the Rambo sequels, let's say. I would put this a little bit closer to the Rambo side, in the sense that the lens of the combat that you're seeing for most of the time is aerial combat, which was considered in that interwar period and even during parts of World War II as these are the sort of the new cavalrymen of warfare. You know, there was that aristocratic air to old warfare that was carried over to these men flying over the trenches and engaging in these epic long dogfights that there'd be crowds of people watching, and they almost became celebrities, right? There were celebrities in World War One as a result of their dogfighting skills, the Red Baron, etc. So I think that by virtue of that being the primary focus of the action sequences, you do miss out a little bit. Although I will say, I was glad to see that the movie did take time to portray some of that more
Yeah.
trench warfare and really just the randomness of the violence. There was one sequence where a young guy is so exhausted he's marching. An officer gives him a cigarette to take a breath, and then not an instant later, a German plane rakes through the crowd, and the guy is shot and killed, very senselessly. And that was one thing I want to hit on that I appreciated about this movie, because you see, while I do think it's aired maybe not pro-war is the wrong word, but like you say,
Yeah.
honoring, the sacrifice of the people involved, I do think they inch toward, in a little bit of a transgressive way, a metaphor almost at different points for how senseless this conflict really was. And in
Mm-hmm.
particular, I think that's encapsulated by the way Jack kills David inadvertently because of this misunderstanding and because of his rage. It reminds me so much of the lead up to the actual World War I and then the human toll afterwards. And there must have been this sensation, the aftermath of, what the fuck did we just do? And why did we do it? And,
Right.
I liked that about the movie. I thought that it did get that point across. I don't know that every viewer would have noticed that or had that same interpretation. But I think that even in glorifying to some extent the valor of the people involved, there was a very clear indication that this war is random, it's indiscriminate.
Right.
These are the flower of our youth, and the title cards spoke in those terms, just dying very senselessly in many cases. And so in that way, I was impressed by it being a little more nuanced.
Yeah, and I think for audiences at the time, right, this is people that they know or knew and loved who might have died in the war. So it was recent enough, right, that you had widows and parents who lost their children watching those scenes. And the movie did include, right, the kind of sequences of families who were not so lucky to have their loved ones return. And that must have really hit home for so many people at the time who had experienced that, because when your loved ones were going off to war, you don't know if you're ever going to see them again. And obviously, many, many, many did not. So,
Well, we're focusing a lot on the war aspect of this film, which was very impressive technically, visually, just cinematically in general. But I
mhm.
also felt like, and this is one of the things I also really liked about it, it had that James Cameron feel of there's a little bit of something for everyone in this movie. And by
Right.
that, I mean, obviously the love triangle, or really quadrangle at this point,
Yeah, a little bit of
but
Pearl
also
Harbor.
some
Yep.
comedic scenes. And if listeners of our first episode will recall, I did a little spoiler of a very impressive shot, which we just got to see, that tracking shot through the room, and some really cool things
Yeah, it was
with,
very cool.
they're all drinking champagne and the bubbles are kind of floating through the air. So that gives you some idea of how the dichotomy there, right, between these really intensive scenes of combat. And again, this is I feel like another potential metaphor for the 1920s, that sensation of let's never do that again. Thank God it's over, and let's kind of party and cut loose and have a good time.
Hmm.
And that whole sequence of them being in Paris kind of made me feel that. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I actually researched the long shot.
Mm.
I researched how they actually did it. And so they created an inverted rig. It was attached to a like a dolly, and they attached the camera upside down so that way it would go in between each of the people
Mm.
sitting on that table. That's how you got that effect that led up to Jack when
Hmm.
he's all drunk.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was pretty neat. I mean, it's something like it was pretty easy to find that information because I guess like any film student or anyone who's
Easy
like,
for us now, but at the time, if you were in the audience, you would have just chalked that up to
yeah,
magic, I feel like.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and it is an impressive shot, which if you were watching the movie without care for when it was made, and just trying to put it into context of what had been done already before, again, that just goes back to what we've talked quite a bit about, where these were pioneers of filmmaking. And as Jake has said before, a lot of audiences, you're seeing things for the first time in every movie you watch, and that's because largely they're being done for the first time. And I just think that is very, very cool. And one thing that I wanted to kind of shout out, we saw in the opening credits that I believe the main screenwriter was Hope Loring, so a woman who ended up writing quite a lot, and I think directing a couple of films in that early Hollywood period as well. And for me, one, it's just cool to see, but two, I will say that beside the war stuff and kind of the like fun relationship, love triangles, etc., I really did like the narrative arc that was especially centered around the friendship of rivals turned friends. And I think it was just masterfully done, and I was engaged throughout. And there were moments where you are genuinely worried for the characters and hoping that the worst doesn't happen. And sometimes it does, because as the Frenchman says at the end, you know, it's war. And I also appreciated that, because in other movies, even ones that we had recently seen, sometimes a happy Hollywood ending gets pulled out of, you know, thin air just because they think, well, audiences want something happy. And sometimes it's not that, you know, you want to see like, no, what actually happens, and really be moved by that kind of truth at that time.
Lori went there, man. She had guts.
Yeah.
She could have gone the easy route out, but I think she was conscious of what she wanted to say.
Right.
And maybe it took a woman who, you know, in that cultural context and time period, you know, I know you have talked about some of our assumptions of that time period in terms of the misogyny may not have been as accurate as they actually were. With this being the pre-code era, maybe women were able to assert themselves more. But I have to imagine someone that gets to that place professionally in a time period that generally is more retrograde and sexist than our own.
Oh, 100%.
Is someone that is a deep thinker. And that really bore through in this movie.
Yeah, early Hollywood, even though, you know, there were women involved in ways that we wouldn't think they were. I know that's definitely not to say that they didn't face barriers specifically because they were women. It's just that we know now, looking back, that those barriers actually got worse instead of better,
Right.
and which is really sad, because I think during this time period, you still have essentially men, women, people from other backgrounds and ethnicities getting to work together and pioneer this new technology of storytelling. And it's like, oh, we're all doing this together.
Yeah.
And then, you know, a few years later, it's like, no, actually, we're not.
Now you might
it's
get
just- it's a
killed
boys'
doing
club.
it together. You might have a plane crash into you, but
Right.
and that's
Yeah, but
kind of
together.
in this movie too, because you have the rich guy and the working class guy, and war becomes the equalizer for them.
Jumping off of what you said earlier about like how you enjoyed the like how they wrote the stories and how it was very gripping, and a lot of when we think about like silent movies is always, you know, a robber or something like that, and a cop chasing a robber, and there's like a lot of like kind of like miming happening. But I guess that was what was in my head
Mhm.
going into watching these movies, and so I was actually surprised when I watched with the Racket and Seventh Heaven and then Wings, because there was actually more of a story.
Right.
And even though there isn't, you know, like synced audio or synced sound, even with the title cards, like it was very brief and general dialogue, but it was enough to give the viewer, you know, a sense of what is happening, or an overarching theme, dialogue, where the story's heading. And so like
Right.
I don't know, I feel like shame is a very
No,
powerful word. But like I was just surprised, because I went into it with a certain preconceived idea already, and then just being very surprised about, oh wow, there's actually depth to
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
stories. There's actually depth to the characters. And even with the filmmaking or the cinematography, like I don't know, I was just again surprised
Yeah.
by like camera angles or different shots, like that one shot that they did in the Racket where they looked at that guy they filmed under
Yeah.
the table, and they were showing that, I guess, like an enemy. And I was like, it was like creative, and for some reason I don't know why I didn't give them credit for it.
I know.
But I think
yeah.
it's just because of what we're told,
Or
or
what, yeah, or just our
presented in like,
assumptions, and the clips that we see are
yes.
often just like, a lot of pantomiming and stuff. But like that's part of the reason why I was excited to embark on this kind of adventure of watching everything to get a deeper understanding, because of those assumptions and knowing that obviously people haven't changed from that much from time to time or anything. And
Totally.
so I was probably very wrong about what movies were like, what they were trying to say about those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, I myself having a strong sense of like, I bet these movies are going to be more engaging narratively. We're going to see some cool cinematography. Even assuming that, I still had other assumptions, like one of the ones being why we had to meet earlier today, because I went into this assuming like, oh, all of these early movies are going to be like an hour long. They didn't have the capability to do these big, long films
we had
yet.
pee breaks, folks. We had a few pee breaks in this one.
Yeah, there was an intermission in this movie. So I was like, oh, okay. We're past the point of just like one short reel films. We are very much into like early Hollywood blockbusters ultimately.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, because like how you were talking about like the ending of Wings, and like when I think about old Hollywood, or
Mhm.
just like, I don't know, anything before like the 60s, I'm just thinking of like really traditional America, where it's like you listen
Right.
to rock and roll and you are
Yeah.
satanic kind of things. You show an ankle and you're, a sleaze. And so I was surprised, because even with Seventh Heaven, it opens up with, I mean, that the sister being abused by her
Yeah,
other,
yeah.
like her sister. And like, it's like within the first couple of minutes of the movie, and I was kind of like, oh, they talked about that stuff back then. I
Right,
thought it
right,
was more of like, you keep that stuff under the rug,
right.
like even the male and female character dynamics, like everything we know right now, current day, is like, oh, men didn't talk about their feelings back then because it wasn't macho, it wasn't manly enough. But from watching these films, like in
Yeah.
Wings,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was obviously a very present bromance
Yeah,
What
oh
do you
yeah.
there,
think it was just
about
a
two guys
bromance?
that
Because
develop a very,
I support
oh,
their relationship
I feel like
wholeheartedly.
yeah, but
if you were like a gay viewer at that time, I could see watching that and saying like, wow, that really resonates for me. Like I'm
100%.
seeing like emotional intimacy between two males of the same gender, and
Mm-hmm.
even though, it's
mhm.
all subtextual or it's not on the face of it, that's not the reality, to portray it that closely,
I
I
mean,
can
we
imagine
we
would have
got a
been
kiss,
meaningful, because there were just as many gay people back then as there are now.
Yeah.
That
It's
is
Yep.
just
true,
it was
yeah.
under the table.
Yeah, but even with the female characters though, because I mean with I mean I wouldn't really say so much in Seventh Heaven, but like in the Racket, I
Mm-hmm.
forgot her name,
He was a
but
great character.
I
Yeah.
mean she was very independent,
Yes.
and she kind of did her own thing. The same thing with Mary and Wings. Like, yes, she was kind of in this unrequited love, kind of like a typical role that a lot of females will play in a kind of romantic setting in a movie. But she was still very strong, and she
Mhm.
still
Right.
she wasn't just like a flat character, so to speak.
Yeah, she wasn't one-dimensional love interest. She had agency. She was very comfortable in her own skin. Ultimately, she went and joined the war effort too. And I second your thoughts completely on the female character in the Racket, whose name escapes me right now. But I loved her. She was the main character to really stand up to this mob boss and even protect other people from putting themselves in danger, and she's willing to put herself in danger for it. And she was just a fantastic character. And I'm really scared to kind of see if the Hays Code has as big of an impact as we know that it overall did. I'm scared to see like a degradation in the quality of characters, especially women and, people of other races, where we, instead of seeing just better and better roles for them, we see more of what we thought of initially, right? That we would get into these very one-dimensional kind of side characters that reinforce stereotypes that we're not proud of today.
That is true. I also feel bad too, because like we're like, we're like, oh yeah, this character, the girl in the Racket. They're like, well, we can't remember her name.
I know.
Well, I was about to say that, I feel like this was maybe the worst time, given the discussion you guys just had, to mention this aspect of the film. And as the one male cast member here, it probably shouldn't be me saying it, but there were boobs in this movie. I could not believe there were boobs in this movie. I was like, whoa, like I forgot they even existed back then. Everybody is so like put together and dolled up and everything. But Janet Gaynor, that's her name, right? The main.
Clara Bow. Janet Gaynor was in Seventh Heaven.
Okay, I'm getting them
this was
confused.
Clara Bow.
I was shocked by that.
Different leading lady.
I was shocked by that. But yeah.
Well, we saw some male butts in early sequences, lined up. So this film is about equality.
Absolutely. But I thought that was kind of cool. I mean, that I would have not expected that.
Yeah, post Hays Code, absolutely not.
Both those instances are quick. It's like blink and you miss it, but it's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was just shocked too. So I'm like, I feel like showing ankle, showing a wrist,
Right.
It's just not. But then again, it's the 20s, the 20s, the fashion, like, completely changed everything. So the flapper dresses and the showing, arms, bare arms and stuff like that. I mean, that was already controversial at the time, even with the makeup. So that is interesting.
Yeah. I think part of what is shocking to me, because there was, as we've talked about before, plenty of nudity in film and kind of like, ooh, scandalous, titillating films that you would go watch in certain theaters and such. But to see it in a picture as well regarded as this, that won Best Picture ultimately, is like, no, it wasn't just in those kind of secret hush-hush films. This was, in big productions as well that went out to general audiences.
That's what I was going to say. It's a barometer culturally of where people were at. And we think of, the pre-60s era as being so tightly wound morally. But there were these little pockets and spaces, Paris in the 20s, Hollywood in the early Hollywood era, that were just experimenting in this more egalitarian and open-minded way. But this being the best picture for 1927, it's really a reflection to me of where society was at this point. And it encompassed a lot. There were those traditional instances of traditional roles, but there were also like a woman professionally pursuing her career and joining the war effort in a way that was impressive. So it was a whole more of a spectrum than I was expecting, which is really, when it comes to artistic portrayals, real life, as we know, is filled with so many different gradations of human beings and experiences. To see that portrayed in this way in this picture at this time period in Hollywood's development, episode 1 here for us, I'm kind of impressed, and I'm really curious, like you just said, Sarah, are we going to see a backtrack soon to where this was an early high point before a dark period in terms of censorship? It'll be interesting to see how that pans out.
So from this year, from the few that we saw, which movies do you all think are still worth watching today? I guess, if any.
Well, I know you guys really like The Racket, and I didn't dislike The Racket. For me, Seventh Heaven was a little bit more resonatory, just like I said, in that almost like prototypical rom-com kind of way, with some tragic elements too. So I would say, if you need a good date night movie, that would be a good one to watch today. And
depending on the date, there might be people who are like, oh, you want to watch a movie, and then you pull up Seventh Heaven and they're like, what?
But anyway, I would say that was a good one that I would probably watch again with other people. The Racket I would watch again, but not like alone for my own interest. And then of course, as we just said, Wings, absolutely loved it. It's now, as far as I'm concerned, in my like top 20 movies, and I'd happily watch that again anytime, particularly with people that haven't already seen it.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend Wings. I think from like, I guess, a filming standpoint, I'm not a person who films or has ever participated in a film, but just from doing the research on the movie and knowing what went in to making the stunts and shooting the aerial scenes, and it's just insane. And it's just like, I respect the director and the people who, you know, were participated in the movie to make that film, because it's a really good film. It's a war movie, but I feel like it's a different flavor of a war movie.
Yeah, definitely.
And I mean, I think both Seventh Heaven and The Racket are definitely still worth watching. Even though I enjoyed The Racket more, I think maybe people would enjoy Seventh Heaven more, just because it's a little lighthearted and it's kind of like, it's an easy to watch film. So I think maybe a wider audience would like that movie more. But regardless, I think pretty much all movies this year are definitely worth watching again. If not just for enjoyment, but just because they're silent films, and I think it'd be cool to kind of immerse yourselves into seeing what you think. Would you like silent films, or you kind of glad that we advanced to having synchronized sound and not having to rely on cue cards and stuff
That's
like
a very
that.
good
But
point.
yeah, definitely make
educational
those
value.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, Wings, 100%. Like, that's something that I would recommend to almost anyone, especially anyone who likes movies. But I think it's just very surprising to see a movie of that quality. And it's that nice extra touch, like you guys are talking about, of it being so different from modern films in terms of, like, this is a silent film, but it's so appreciable by, I think, any audience, anyone watching it, that it is a great movie and is truly worth watching. I think with Seventh Heaven and The Racket, as someone who, like, really loves seeing the history of it and everything, I enjoyed watching them. But I kind of feel like for the everyday moviegoer, like, I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to see either one of them. But if you are interested in silent movies, or if you are interested in, kind of that World War I romance, or, mobster film during, like, actual prohibition, kind of liking the context that they were made in, or if your date puts on Seventh Heaven or whatever, it's just like, okay, maybe then, they're not something to not watch. But I don't know if I would go out of my way to do, like, a rewatch or anything personally.
But as you say, the real heads out there, the real cinephiles, both of you guys made good points. You will want to watch these for the historical value.
Yeah, definitely. That's very valuable, for sure. For sure.
Did we feel like Wings was the deserving winner for 1927 Oscars?
I think so. I think out of all three of them, I think it definitely deserved it.
Resounding yes from me. It was already so elevated in terms of direction, cinematography, and then the narrative just drove that home even more for me, where it was, that is the undisputed winner between the three for me.
To play devil's advocate for the sake of argument, because I'm at my sappy self, I did like the ending to Seventh Heaven, and I thought that was cute and unexpected, and I just enjoyed the movie overall. But I feel like it would be disingenuous to say that Wings did not deserve it, because it absolutely did. From a technical standpoint, from a story standpoint, the emotional resonance of that closing sequence after David is shot down, I was genuinely moved by that, and I enjoyed this picture. I consider this in the top tier of movies that I've seen. I've seen a lot of movies.
Yeah,
so
same. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our first full episode. Next episode, we'll be looking at the second year of the Oscars and the nominees that year, if you are wanting to watch along, or if you're just wanting to have a little bit of a preview for next episode. The Alibi, Hollywood Revue, In Old Arizona, The Patriot, and the Broadway Melody. So hope you all make some time, join us, like, comment, subscribe, if that's a thing with whatever podcast platform. But be sure to give us a follow and just join us on this journey.